It was supposed to be just another day in court. Judge Mark Reynolds had seen hundreds of cases in his career, each one blurring into the next. But when the next defendant walked into the courtroom, everything changed. His heart skipped a beat. The man standing before him in an orange jumpsuit wasn't just another name on the docket. He was someone from his past. Someone he never thought he'd see in a place like this. The defendant, Eric Dawson, looked up and locked eyes with the judge. For a moment, the courtroom fell silent. Decades ago, they had been inseparable, best friends running through their childhood streets, dreaming about the future. But now, Eric was facing serious charges, and Mark was the one who had to decide his fate. Questions flooded Mark's mind. How had Eric ended up here? What had gone so wrong? And most importantly, could he remain impartial, or would his past cloud his judgment? As the trial unfolded, shocking revelations came to light, forcing Mark to make an impossible choice. Stay tuned because what happens next will leave you speechless. Mark's grip tightened on his gavel as he forced himself to stay professional. He couldn't let personal history interfere with his job. But as the prosecutor began listing the charges, grand theft, fraud, and resisting arrest, Mark couldn't help but wonder. Was this really the same Eric he once knew? The boy who used to sneak out with him to watch late-night baseball games. The kid who swore they'd always have each other's backs. Eric stood there, his eyes filled with something Mark couldn't quite read: shame, regret, or maybe even defiance. He barely looked at his attorney, and he never once glanced back at the courtroom spectators. It was as if he had already accepted whatever fate was coming. Mark's mind drifted back to the last time they had spoken. It had been years ago, long before law school, before life pulled them in separate directions. Eric had always been the risk-taker, the one who laughed in the face of danger. But had he really fallen so far? The defense attorney stood up, ready to present Eric's side of the story. Mark braced himself. He had a feeling this was going to be a trial unlike any other. Eric's attorney, a sharp but tired-looking woman named Rachel Monroe, adjusted her glasses and approached the bench. "Your Honor, my client has pleaded not guilty. There are circumstances that need to be considered before judgment is passed." Mark nodded, keeping his expression unreadable, but inside, his thoughts raced. Circumstances. What could possibly explain how Eric ended up here? Rachel turned toward the jury. Eric Dawson isn't a criminal. He's a man who made a desperate choice in a desperate situation. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. But before we assume the worst, we need to ask, how did he get here? The prosecutor scoffed, arms crossed. The facts are clear. He stole thousands of dollars from his former employer, a small family business. Surveillance footage caught him in the act. There's no misunderstanding here. Eric kept his head down, his hands clasped tightly together. He hadn't said a word since the trial began. Mark studied his old friend, searching for something: remorse, defiance, or even just a sign that the Eric he once knew was still in there. Then for the first time, Eric lifted his gaze. His voice was low but steady. "I didn't have a choice." The courtroom went silent. Mark felt a chill run down his spine at Eric's words. Asterisky didn't have a choice asterisk. What did he mean? His pulse quickened as he glanced at Rachel, who hesitated before continuing. "My client was put in an impossible situation," she said, her voice measured but firm. "Yes, there is security footage. Yes, he took the money. But what you won't see on that footage is asterisk why asterisk he did it." The prosecutor shook his head. The why doesn't change the crime. Rachel turned back to Eric. "Tell them," she urged. Eric exhaled slowly, gripping the edges of the podium as if steadying himself. "I needed the money. Not for myself, but for my sister. His voice wavered for the first time. She was sick. The hospital bills were piling up. I tried everything, extra jobs, loans, even selling my car. Nothing was enough. And then someone offered me a way out. Mark's jaw tightened. Someone? Eric's eyes darkened. I didn't want to do it, but they made it clear. Either I took the money, or I'd lose more than just my job. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Mark felt his stomach sink. This wasn't just about theft anymore. This was something much bigger. Mark's grip on his gavel tightened. Something about Eric's words sent a wave of unease through him. "Who are you talking about?" he asked, his voice measured but firm. Eric hesitated. His eyes darted toward the back of the courtroom, as if searching for someone. A muscle in his jaw tensed. "I can't say." The prosecutor sighed dramatically. "Your Honor, this is getting ridiculous. The facts remain." Rachel cut in. "If my client speaks, he puts himself in danger." She turned to Eric. "But they can't hurt you here. Tell the court the truth." Eric swallowed hard. "It wasn't just me. There's a whole operation behind this. I was approached by someone with power. They told me exactly when and how to take the money. And if I refused, my sister would have paid the price." A hushed gasp spread across the room. Mark's stomach twisted. This wasn't just a case of desperation. Eric had been forced into this. But by who asterisk? Then suddenly, the back doors of the courtroom creaked open. A man in a dark suit slipped inside, his gaze locked onto Eric. Eric's face went pale. Mark followed his line of sight, and his blood ran cold. He knew that man. And if he was here, it meant this case was far from over. Eric's hands clenched into fists as his eyes stayed locked on the man in the back of the courtroom. Mark's heart pounded. He recognized him, Jonathan Hayes, a high-profile businessman with a spotless public image, but whispered rumors of corruption and intimidation. If Eric was telling the truth, this trial had just taken a dangerous turn. Rachel noticed Eric's fear and turned to the judge. "Your Honor, my client is willing to cooperate, but we request protection. If he speaks, his life and his sister's could be in danger." The prosecutor scoffed. "Are we seriously entertaining conspiracy theories now?" Mark ignored him. His focus was on Eric. "If you have evidence, now is the time." Eric took a shaky breath and reached into his pocket. "Before I was arrested, I recorded a phone call," he said. "It proves I was threatened." Rachel pulled out a small USB drive and handed it to the bailiff. Moments later, the courtroom filled with a chilling voice. "Take the money, or your sister won't make it through the week. No cops, no questions. Do what you're told. Asterisk." The jury gasped. But just as Mark prepared to take control of the courtroom, a loud commotion erupted. Jonathan Hayes stood up and, with a calm smirk, walked out. No resistance. No fear. Eric's face drained of color. "You don't understand," he whispered. "This isn't over." He wanted to be seen. Mark's stomach dropped. If Hayes wasn't running, it meant he had already planned his next move. Mark sat frozen for a moment, watching as Jonathan Hayes disappeared through the courtroom doors. He could feel the weight of what had just happened. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for now, he had a job to finish. Clearing his throat, he turned back to Eric. "The recording is damning evidence. We'll make sure it's properly investigated," he said. "But for now, we need to focus on your case." The prosecutor, now visibly uneasy, shifted in his seat. Given the new evidence, the charges against the defendant should be reconsidered, he admitted reluctantly. Rachel stood. Your Honor, we request that all charges be dropped. Mark exhaled, glancing at Eric. He wasn't the reckless kid from their childhood anymore. He was a man who had been backed into a corner, forced to make an impossible choice. After a long pause, he made his ruling. The charges against Eric Dawson are dismissed. Relief washed over Eric's face, but there was no celebration. He knew, just as Mark did, that this wasn't a true ending, only the beginning of something bigger. As the courtroom emptied, Mark glanced toward the door, knowing they had just uncovered a much deeper truth. And some truths didn't stay buried for long.